Story 1. I see a lot of octopus facts, but what I find most interesting, besides their intelligence and hearts, is that they only live about 3 years. They mate once and die. Story 2. George Stephen Morrison, the United States Navy captain who commanded local American forces during the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which led to the escalation of United States involvement in the Vietnam War, was the father of Jim Morrison, the lead singer of The Doors. Story 3. About 2/3 of your human ancestors are female. It's because of pedigree collapse where you should have 2 parents for grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, etc. So, going back about 30 generations, you should have 1 billion ancestors, which is more people than even existed. In reality, as you go back in your family tree, the same people start to appear multiple times. For example, anyone with any English blood will have King Edward I as an ancestor on dozens of separate lines because of his many children, including illegitimate ones. The flip side of this is that many more males than females leave no descendants at all. Story 4. Found this out while working at a veterinarian clinic. A sloth takes so long to digest food that it can starve to death on a full stomach. Nature is just weird sometimes. Story 5. There is a species of jellyfish called Turritopsis dohrnii, also known as the immortal jellyfish, that can literally reverse its aging process. When it is injured, sick, or even just stressed, it reverts its cells back to their earliest form, essentially starting its life over again. It is like the creature figured out how to cheat death, hitting the reset button on its existence. Crazy in my opinion. Story 6. Mazda has had 2 of the most oddly specific product recalls in automotive history. They had to recall a number of Mazda 6 vehicles because spiders kept infesting the fuel lines. For some reason, this problem was limited to 1 model and only 1 generation of that model. Spiders didn't interfere with any of their other cars. They had to recall a number of other cars because the infotainment system would break whenever users tried to listen to 94.9 KOW radio in Seattle. It wasn't the wavelength. Stations on 94.9 in other cities were completely fine. This problem was specific to the KUOW station. Story 7. Tasmanian devil populations are heavily impacted by a contagious cancer that causes facial tumors. When devils bite each other on the face, the cancer cells spread from one individual to the next, and due to low genetic variation, it is able to evade the new host's immune system and multiply. These cancer cells originally started out as normal Tasmanian devil cells but are now a separate parasitic organism. However, by phylogenetic classification, they are considered a descendant of Tasmanian devils and would also be considered a marsupial. Similar contagious cancers have been found in dogs, Syrian hamsters, and clams. Story 8. The bristlemouth fish, also known as cyclothone, is estimated to have a population of up to 250,000,000 individuals, making it the most abundant vertebrate on Earth. Story 9. We do not actually know what song the monsters are dancing to in Monster Mash. The song we are hearing is the singer recounting the monsters dancing, but not the song they are dancing to. Story 10. Hummingbirds' feet are so small that they only use them for perching, scratching, and nest building. Instead of using their feet to launch into flight, the wings do all the work. Their order name, apodiforms, meaning footless, makes sense when seeing a hummingbird in flight. Their feet are nearly invisible. While they do have feet, they do not have knees. Story 11. On the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore the Louisiana Purchase, the group happened to encounter Sacagawea's brother, whose tribe helped them make it through the winter. Story 12. The villagers of Llandwin, Wales, elected a goat named Bryn as their honorary mayor in 1999. Bryn, a charismatic goat known for his impressive horns and calm demeanor, was chosen in a light-hearted ceremony. The villagers believed that having a goat as mayor would bring a unique charm to the town and attract tourists. Bryn fulfilled his duties by appearing at local events, leading parades, and becoming a beloved symbol of the community's spirit and humor. Story 13. Janet Jackson's 1989 song Rhythm Nation can crash some laptops with specific hard drives. The song's resonant frequency matches the natural resonant frequency of certain hard drives, causing them to shut down. Story 14. A day on Venus is longer than its year. I learned this in astronomy class and still cannot wrap my head around it. The planet literally takes longer to rotate once than to go around the sun. Space is weird. Story 15. Birds cannot taste spice. This is actually why peppers evolved. The spice would keep other animals away, so only birds would eat them and spread their seeds. Then humans came along and decided, this hurts good, and made them much more powerful than they would be in nature. Story 16. The four people of Papua New Guinea practiced ritual funerary cannibalism. Unfortunately, a prion disease called kuru began to spread. It was transmitted when members of the tribe consumed infected human flesh. In the late stages of kuru, right before one dies, it causes paralysis, which leads to a period of immobility prior to dying. This causes a thin layer of fat to develop around the entire body. Apparently, this thin layer of fat made people very delicious, so infected bodies were actually prioritized for cannibalistic funerary practices. Story 17. For all of history, no human had ever flown until 1903. By 1969, humans were walking on the moon. It just sounds impossible to me that humans went from a plane that only flew for 12 seconds to successfully going on a trip to the moon and back in less than one lifetime. For reference, it took roughly 200 years to go from flintlock guns to automatic weapons. And humans love killing each other more than anything else. Story 18. I found out yesterday that in 2011, a man in Australia discovered an exploit on the automated teller machines where he could press transfer and move as much money as he wanted between his accounts. The transaction would appear cancelled, but it wasn't, allowing him to spend millions of dollars for 4.5 months until his conscience caught up with him. He attempted to turn himself in multiple times and even went on television to tell people about what he was doing, essentially stealing millions from the banks. Despite his efforts to confess, it took a long time for anyone to investigate him, and when they finally did, he received only 1 year in jail and was required to repay just a fraction of the money he took. It's quite an interesting story. Story 19. During the last Ebola outbreak in the United States, it was more likely that you would date Taylor Swift and have her write a hit song about your breakup than you were to get Ebola. Story 20. If you have a surgery that involves your intestines being put back in, they just place them back in, and they sort themselves out. It's a very interesting feeling when you feel them shifting around. Story 21. Europeans were familiar with the great auk, which they called penguins and hunted to extinction. When they started exploring the Antarctic regions, they discovered birds that looked similar and also called them penguins. But the birds we call penguins today are not actually related to the great auk. Story 22. Jimmy Carter is the only former United States president to have lived for over 40 years after leaving office. He is also the oldest ever former president. Donald Trump will be the oldest man to be inaugurated as president. He is also the first president since the 1890s to serve his terms non-consecutively. Story 23. Taken from a reference frame of the center of the sun, if you were to chart your path through the solar system, it is unlikely that you will ever occupy any point in space more than once in your lifetime. Story 24. 9% of United States presidents either died or were born on the 4th of July. Everyone knows John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who died on July 4th, 1826. But there's also James Monroe, who died on July 4th, 1831, and Calvin Coolidge, who was born on July 4th, 1872. Story 25. New Mexico is older than Mexico. The territory of New Mexico was established by Spain in 1592. While the country of Mexico won independence from Spain and adopted that name in 1821. Both are named after a valley in present-day Mexico. Story 26. How long does it take to count to 1 billion? Counting to a billion manually can take over 100 years. If you count each number in a second, it would take 31.7 years to reach a billion. However, it may take longer than 60 years because it takes more than a second to say many of the numbers. Also, if you were to receive $10,000 every day, it would take 274 years to make $1 billion. Story 27. Back during the Bush administration in Fort Bragg, they were training monkeys with harpoons for combat. Well, they escaped with the harpoons. So they ended up running around Fayetteville terrorizing the place. They even told us to watch out for public bathrooms, as there may be monkeys with harpoons in there. There is nothing on the internet about it, And the only reference to it I could find was in Will Ferrell's You're Welcome, America thing. Story 28. In the 1950s, the Knights Hospitallers, yes, the same ones from the Crusades, had a few bomber planes. Our timeline had a Crusader Air Force. Also, the Air Force doesn't exist anymore, but the Knights do have observer status at the United Nations and issue passports. Story 29. Most fish don't fart, but herring do. A study found they likely communicate via farting. It's like their own version of social media. Instead of Twitter, it's Squeaker. Story 30. The head of security at the World Trade Center buildings at the time of September 11th had previously worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation and had several times highlighted the risk posed by Osama bin Laden. Story 31. U.S. Geography Fun Facts. Reno, Nevada, is west of Los Angeles, California, a state on the West Coast. Detroit, Michigan, is east of Atlanta, Georgia, a state on the East Coast. Maine is the closest United States state to the African continent. Story 32. Cleopatra lived closer in time to the building of the first Pizza Hut than to the building of the pyramids. The first Pizza Hut opened in Wichita, Kansas on June 15, 1958. That means that the chain's opening is about 500 years closer to Cleopatra's lifetime than the construction of the Giza pyramids. Story 33. A circle is not the only shape with a constant width. Another example is the Riulos triangle, and this property means that this shape can be used as the basis to design a drill bit that can drill a square hole, although there is a slight fillet in the corner. I've told people in a couple of workplaces this in the early 1990s before the internet became widespread, so at the time very few people believed it, and I could not back it up easily. In fact, most of the people I told mocked me afterward for believing something they thought was so wrong. Story 34. Project Sundial was a proposed doomsday/planet killer weapon designed by Edward Teller. What we know, it would have had a 10 gigaton blast, enough to essentially erase the North American Southwest instantly and contaminate virtually every corner of the Earth, rendering it uninhabitable. Teller's team was already working on it at Lawrence Livermore at the time he proposed it to others at the Atomic Energy Commission. Everyone on record about it reported shock and horror at the idea of such a device. There was a test scheduled of the primary trigger for the device, codenamed Gnomon, itself reportedly a very large explosive device, but it did not actually take place. What we don't know, literally anything else, notably how it would have worked or how far they got, is still classified. Story 35. George Washington was responsible for starting the 7 Years' War, possibly the first truly global military conflict. He started a world war, and it's one of the least interesting things about his life. Story 36. Asparagus just grows like that out of the dirt. No plant body to pull it from or anything. It just looks like someone went around sticking spears in the ground to try to trick you into thinking they grow that way. Story 37. The orchestra hit sound effect popular in 1980s and 1990s rhythm and blues and pop music, and retro-sounding music today like Bruno Mars, was originally sampled from a recording of The Firebird by Igor Stravinsky, specifically the opening chord of the movement, The Infernal Dance. Story 38. The British fought and paid off the rest of the world for over 60 years to end slavery. Even after paying, other nations and companies went back on the deals and continued to deal in slaves. This prompted the British to send the Royal Navy to Africa and begin raids on slave ships to rescue and free hundreds of thousands of slaves. Considering the pushback against the British for this stance, had they not done so, it is conceivable that the Atlantic slave trade would be alive and well today. Story 39. I've always liked the one about the difference between $1 million and $1 billion. Imagine someone gave you $1 million and told you to spend $1,000 every day and come back when you ran out of money. You would return with no money left in 3 years. If someone then gave you $1 billion and you spent $1,000 each day, you would be spending for about 2,740 years before you went broke. Story 40. The most effective strain of penicillin was found on a moldy cantaloupe in Peoria, Illinois, right where the mass production methodology of penicillin was developed. Story 41. I learned this from John McPhee, Annals of the Former World. The rock at the summit of Mount Everest is a fossil-rich marine limestone. What a journey those fossils have been on, from the bottom of the sea to the top of the world.